Hello everyone, and welcome to the wonderful recap of Oz. My name is Justin Peavy, and I will be reading through L. Frank Baum's novels and diving into a few of the countless film, television, stage, and literary adaptations taking place in the magical land of Oz. Thanks again for tuning in. A very peculiar episode is in store for you, and I hope you are ready for a stark difference in tone. We've made it to the fourth book, entitled Dorothy and the Wizard in Oz. It was written by L. Frank Baum and illustrated by John R. Neal, who illustrated the previous two installments as well. However, this time around, the color plates are watercolor illustrations, which I think are a more appropriate fit for the feel of this book. Book 4 was published in 1908, and as the title suggests, we see the return of the wizard, who has not been heard from since he left in a balloon for Omaha in Book 1. As always, Baum opens the book with a note to his readers. Instead of trying to summarize it, I think I'll just read you some passages from Baum's own words. It's no use at all. The children won't let me stop telling tales of the land of Oz. I know lots of other stories, and I hope to tell them sometime or another, but just now, my loving tyrants won't allow me. They cry, Oz, Oz, more about Oz, Mr. Baum, and what can I do but obey their commands? This is our book, mine and the children's, for they have flooded me with thousands of suggestions in regard to it, and I have honestly tried to adopt as many of these suggestions as could be fitted into one story. I believe, my dears, that I am the proudest storyteller that ever lived. Many a time, tears of pride and joy have stood in my eyes while I read the tender, loving, appealing letters that come to me in almost every mail from my little readers. To have pleased you, to have interested you, to have won your friendship and perhaps your love through my stories, is to my mind as great an achievement as to become President of the United States. So you have helped me to fulfill my life's ambition, and I am more grateful to you, my dears, than I can express in words. I try to answer every letter of my young correspondents, yet sometimes there are so many letters that a little time must pass before you get your answer. But be patient, friends, for the answer will surely come, and by writing to me, you more than repay me for the pleasant task of preparing these books. Besides, I am proud to acknowledge that the books are partly yours, for your suggestions often guide me in telling the stories, and I'm sure they would not be half so good without your clever and thoughtful assistance. In addition to these words, Baum acknowledges that he is very much influenced by his fans' desire to know more about Dorothy, the Wizard, and Ozma. He also promises to tell more about Toto in the next Oz book. I'm concerned that the people-pleaser attitude Baum adopted may lead to a dip in quality, or at least the integrity of Baum's work. It's tough to balance the wants of the self and the wants of others, and clearly this author's note is quite telling of that fact. I'm starting to feel much more sympathetic for the author's inability to branch out as much as he would like to. Of course, I can tell how grateful he is for the success of the Oz stories, but there is also an underlying feeling that the author is somewhat trapped. Without giving too much away yet, maybe this is why this book is darker. Maybe this is why the characters depicted are struggling to go through different lands and are constantly being fought with because of their differences. Maybe this is why, despite constantly traveling to many worlds and pursuing desires that are ultimately unfulfilling, they always end up back in Oz. Perhaps I'm overanalyzing because I couldn't find a lot online about the circumstances surrounding this book, but maybe you'll all form your own opinion about the matter after hearing my synopsis. Without further delay, allow me to recount the adventures of Dorothy and the Wizard in Oz. It has been a week since Dorothy Gale left Australia. She arrives at Hudson Siding in California, having traveled from San Francisco by train. Carrying a suitcase, a parasol, and a birdcage with a kitten inside, she disembarks from the train car. She finds a horse and buggy waiting for her, with a boy sleeping in the seat. She wakes him up and introduces herself to the boy, who she learns is her second cousin, Zebediah. He announces that he is going to take Dorothy to Hugson's ranch, where her Uncle Henry is visiting with relatives. Zeb and Dorothy start their ride, the buggy being carried by an old horse called Jim. Dorothy explains that her train was delayed due to a series of earthquakes in California, and that she'll only be visiting for a day before she and her uncle start back for Kansas. Zeb also calls attention to the birdcage, and Dorothy explains that it contains her kitten Eureka. While they're riding, they experience a severe tremor that cracks the land open for a moment. They cautiously continue their ride, but another earthquake occurs. The earth splits beneath the horse's feet and they fall into the earth. Dorothy and Zeb grab hold of the buggy as the earth closes above them, and they fall into darkness. Despite their certainty that they will fall to their deaths, Dorothy discovers that they have started to fall slowly and gently. They fall for an indeterminate amount of time before they begin to see some light. They all relax a bit, coming to the conclusion that they will not die from the fall, but they're still uneasy about what's to come. The buggy tips, but the laws of gravity seem non-existent. The horse has trouble getting upright, but eventually he does this and he says, "Well, that's better." This shocks Dorothy and Zeb, specifically the latter, who had never heard an animal talk before. They begin to see a landscape with multicolored mountains, plains, lakes, and rivers, as well as several houses and buildings made of sparkling glass. They float gently down until they safely land upon a roof. Zeb leaps out of the buggy, knocking over the birdcage. Dorothy runs to Eureka's aid, only to find out that she can also speak in perfect English. They look around and notice there is a large hole smashed into the roof they just landed on. Other buildings were suffering from similar circumstances. A man appears from the hole and discovers the children with their animals. He starts to back away and finds himself at the roof's edge. Dorothy cries out to him, but the man steps off the roof and walks on air. He walks calmly from the roof to the ground, astonishing Dorothy. Eureka immediately discovers that she too can walk in the air. They all deliberate as to whether or not they should try it as well, and Dorothy asks Zeb to go first. He makes his hesitant attempt and succeeds, with Dorothy and Jim following suit. They make their way to the ground, where the people begin to leave their homes to investigate the newcomers. Eventually, a man with a star over his forehead approaches and asks if they are the ones who caused the rain of stones. Zeb explains that they didn't cause it, but the falling debris was likely due to the earthquake. The man claims that until they can prove their innocence, they are holding their visitors responsible. He then leads them to the house of the sorcerer with the hopes that he will be able to discover the truth. The man brings Dorothy, Zeb, Jim, and Eureka to a large glass palace. He calls out for someone called Gwig, and suddenly a man covered in thorns appears through a cloud of smoke. Gwig asks why they have dared to enter the land of the mangaboos without an invitation, and also why they sent the rain of stones. Dorothy tries to defend them and explain that it was an earthquake, but the ignorant sorcerer Gwig is not satisfied with the answer. The sorcerer and the man with the star, otherwise referred to as the prince, also bicker about how trustworthy Gwig really is. Another mangaboo runs into the palace and alerts the prince that there is more excitement outside. Everyone, save for the sorcerer, runs out of the palace and they see a balloon descending very slowly. After 3 hours, the balloon finally lands in the town square. A little bald man with a tall hat leaps out of the basket, and Dorothy immediately recognizes him as the Wizard of Oz. The prince instantly interrogates the wizard, who explains that he wasn't aware that he was entering the land of the mangaboos. He says he went up in a balloon the day before, and upon its descent, it fell into a crack in the earth, making his arrival a complete accident. He also confirms his status as a wizard, but the prince demands proof. He's then led to the palace to confront the sorcerer. The prince announces to the wizard that the sorcerer's only fault is that he makes so many incorrect statements. He then scolds Gwig for assuring him that there would be no more stones or people descending from the sky, which makes the wizard feel better knowing that there are humbugs inside the earth as well as on top of it. When the fighting ends, Gwig announces that the wizard must prove his magical abilities. If he is deemed more powerful than the sorcerer, then he will be made chief wizard of the mangaboos. If not, then he will be killed. Gwig waves his hand, and suddenly the sound of bells ringing fills the room. The wizard then places his hat on the floor and brings a small piglet out of it. Using a sleight of hand trick, he fools the mangaboos into thinking that he is pulling the piglets apart to make more piglets. Ultimately, he displays 9 piglets and makes them all disappear again. The prince announces that the wizard is indeed more powerful than the sorcerer. This angers Gwig, who then announces that he will be stopping the wizard's breath. The wizard then pulls out a collapsible sword, assembles it, and slices the sorcerer's body in 2. Dorothy is expected to be horrified, but a lack of gore proves that Gwig is not made of human flesh, but he is actually vegetable-based. The prince explains that all of the mangaboos are vegetables, and everything in the land of the mangaboos is grown naturally, and the wizard's action had just killed the sorcerer. Since he is now dead, the sorcerer must be planted so another sorcerer may sprout. The prince orders some of his people to carry the remains of the sorcerer to the public garden, and the mangaboos' visitors accompany them. They dig a hole in the ground and bury the sorcerer, but the prince assures that he will sprout soon. The prince brings everyone to another garden where they come across many rows of bushes where the mangaboo people grow from. People of all ages are seen sprouting from the bushes, and Dorothy notices that the only children that can be found are still being grown. It's explained that the mangaboos become ripe when they reach adulthood, when they are easily picked and expected to live for around 5 years afterwards. They also don't eat because they aren't made of flesh. The prince leads them to the royal bush of the mangaboos, where all the land's rulers grow from. On this bush, they see a beautiful woman in a satin gown growing from its center stalk. She is revealed to be the next ruler who will succeed the prince when she is ripe. Dorothy is led to believe that she is indeed ready to be picked. The prince hesitates before saying that she will not be ready for several days. Changing the subject, the prince states that he must dispose of their visitors. He intends to keep the wizard until a new sorcerer is picked, but everyone else must be destroyed because they can't be planted. When they are ordered to follow the prince back to the palace, Dorothy and the wizard conspire to pick the royal princess so she may supersede the prince. They quickly do this while the prince's back is turned, and the princess thanks them for picking her. When the prince returns with his people, the princess confronts him. She states that she was wronged by the prince because she was ready to be picked for an entire week, but he abandoned her in his selfishness. She takes the Star of Royalty from him before he walks away and is not seen again. The Mangaboo people escort the princess to her palace while Dorothy, Zeb, and the wizard linger in the gardens and continue to walk in the air. The wizard concludes that being close to the center of the earth affects the attraction of gravity, and Dorothy concludes that they are in a fairy country because that allows Eureka and Jim to talk. They all eat some fruits from the gardens while the wizard explains his sleight of hand trick that fooled the Mangaboos. He then releases the 9 unusually small piglets which he got from the island of Teenyweent. They reveal that they too can speak, and then they feed on the grass. Eureka demands milk and meat to nourish her, and suggests that she eat one of the piglets. The wizard declines her request, but goes to a nearby brook to catch a fish for Eureka to eat. He succeeds, and Eureka eats it in mere moments. The wizard puts the piglets back in his pockets, and everyone heads back to the city to stay in the house of the sorcerer. They find their way inside and explore the house for sleeping quarters, but they don't find any because the Mangaboos don't sleep. Despite not having a comfortable bed, everyone falls asleep on some glass benches. When they awake, the wizard asks Zeb to run to his balloon and fetch his satchel, 2 lanterns, and a can of kerosene oil. By the time he returns, Dorothy awakens and they hear Jim the cab horse calling to them. When they find him, they also learn that the princess and several Mangaboos had entered the house of the sorcerer. The princess announces that the visitors don't belong in their land, so they must be destroyed. She plans to throw Dorothy, Zeb, and the wizard into the garden of the twining vines, where they will be crushed and devoured. Eureka and Jim will subsequently be driven into a black pit, which is situated in the mountains. The wizard assures the princess the Mangaboos are still in need of an acting sorcerer, so he reprises his piglet trick. The princess is unimpressed, so the wizard balances his sword on his nose, which I would argue is even less satisfying. Then he announces a new trick. He will create 2 suns that the Mangaboos had never seen, as well as a destroyer, more dreadful than the vines. Using a matchbox, he lights his 2 lanterns and places them on the heads of Dorothy and Zeb. He then pours kerosene on the glass floor of the palace and sets it ablaze. He tells the princess that he has created a circle of light, and if the advisors who told her to throw the humans into the vines were right in their judgments, they will step through the flame and be unharmed. The princess commands them to take the wizard's test, and they are both scorched in the process. The princess acknowledges the wizard's supreme power and allows him, Dorothy, and Zeb to live. However, her mind remains unchanged about sending the animals into the black pit. For what seems like a few days, everyone waits in the house of the sorcerer in peace. While the wizard sleeps, he lets the piglets out of his pockets and they play with Eureka. Eventually, the Mangaboos carrying thorny branches silently fill the room. They attack the animals with them and drive them out of the house. They lead the animals down the street, guiding them toward the black pit. They retaliate as best they can, but they are outnumbered and are forced to give in to the Mangaboos' demands. They go halfway up a towering glass mountain before they arrive at a dark cave. Once the animals are inside, the Mangaboos start piling up the entrance with large glass rocks to prevent them from leaving. Eureka devises a plan and leaps out of the cave through a small opening. The Mangaboos try to chase her through the air, but she is much lighter and faster than they are. She sprints back to the house of the sorcerer and wakes Dorothy up. Afterwards, they alert Zeb and the wizard, and they prepare to rescue the animals. Upon their arrival at the pit, the wizard commands the Mangaboos to stop. He begins to pull the rocks away, but once there's enough space, the princess orders for people to arm themselves with their thorns. They force the humans inside the pit, and they pile the rocks up again. The wizard puts the piglets back in his pockets before their source of light disappears entirely. Zeb lights the lanterns after they are completely walled in. They decide to follow the path inside the cave to see where the tunnel leads. Dorothy, Zeb, the wizard, and Eureka board the buggy that had been dragged there by the mangaboos, and Jim leads the way through the cave. They continue their steep ascent until they see a bright light ahead of them. They make their way out of the mountain and come across a valley with beautiful lawns, orchards, and gardens, tall trees, and alluring brooks. They also see dozens of cottages, but they make two strange observations. First, that it's lighted from an unknown source, and second, that it seems to be completely deserted. Despite hearing birds overhead, they can't seem to find any signs of animal life. Eureka is upset to learn they can no longer walk in the air, but everyone else is content on the ground. They come across a fruit that is growing from the ground. Before Dorothy gets a chance to pick it, it's devoured by the piglets. Suddenly, the piglets disappear. Everyone is startled by this and begins calling out to the piglets. They hear the voices of the piglets explaining that they are right beside them. The wizard feels around on the ground, eventually feeling a piglet's body and coming to the conclusion that whatever fruit the piglets just ate turned them invisible. The wizard gathers all of the piglets and keeps them in his pocket where he can be sure of their location. They all walk toward a cottage and look through the front door. They find a dinner scene, with plenty of food and several forks and knives moving by themselves. An invisible family begins to speak to their visitors and invites them inside to have dinner with them. The matriarch explains that the people in the Valley of Voe can't be seen because they have eaten dama fruit. The dama fruit makes whoever eats it invisible, which allows the people of Voe to better hide from the vicious, invisible bears. It also gives them the opportunity to enjoy the beauty of the nature surrounding them. The visitors agree not to eat the dama fruit because they would rather stay visible. The voice of a child advises against this because it makes them more vulnerable. The wizard then wants to know if there is any way to get back to the top of the earth. A man's voice expresses that it's very difficult because you have to go through a less pleasant country first. He directs them to the spiral staircase inside the Pyramid Mountain, which will bring them to the land of Nott, inhabited by gargoyles. Only one man climbed the staircase and fought the gargoyles before. He escaped after 9 days and upon his return was eaten by bears. The only thing they knew is that gargoyles are afraid of noise. Everyone bids goodbye to the people of Voe and they begin to cross the valley to the Pyramid Mountain. After a while, they stop to allow Jim to rest, but they hear a voice say, "There are bears nearby. Be careful." The voice tells Dorothy that they have to cross the river to escape. An invisible hand plucks a plant from the ground, and a voice tells the wizard that they must rub the leaves on the soles of their feet. If they do this, they'll be able to walk on water. The wizard leads Dorothy, Zeb, Eureka, and Jim in rubbing their feet on the plant. As soon as this is done, they begin to hear growling sounds. Gashes appear on Jim's body as the invisible bears attack them. They all run for the river as the wizard uses his sword to kill one of the bears, which reverses the charm of the dama fruit, revealing the bear's true form. Once they're on the water, the wizard mends Jim's wounds and they make their way to the Pyramid Mountain. After several hours, they find their way on land, and the wizard tells Jim to trot as fast as he can in case there are more bears around. Jim tries his best, wounds and old age considering, but Zeb makes a growling sound to startle Jim. The horse immediately begins running much faster, and before they know it, they're at the foot of the mountain. The mountain is so tall that it gets lost in the clouds. Our protagonists are standing before a broad stairway that spirals through the inside of the mountain. Everyone steps out of the buggy so Jim can easily pull it up the stairs, and they begin their ascent. At one point, they find an opening in the mountain that looks down upon a sea with flames rolling off of the waves, as several large birds fly through the air. They also see cloud fairies in the sky, and the author explains that people on Earth usually can't distinguish the fairies from the clouds, but since our heroes are so near to the clouds, they have that luxury. Suddenly, the wizard sees a man standing in the cave. He is an old man with white hair that's so long it reaches his feet. His beard is the same way, and all of the hair is carefully braided with ribbons. He explains that he used to live on Earth, but now lives halfway up the Pyramid Mountain. He was an inventor who had a factory in the mountain known for making products known as flutters and rustles. The flutters allow flags to wave on a day with no wind, and the rustles are useful for women's silk gowns. He offers Dorothy and the wizard these products in exchange for a blue hair ribbon, which they curiously accept. The braided man continues to explain that, while on Earth, he used to manufacture imported holes for American Swiss cheese, pores for porous plasters, and holes for donuts and buttons. He then invented a large quantity of adjustable post holes that he stored in the ground. When he leaned over to look into the large hole he had made, he fell in and tumbled all the way down to the Pyramid Mountain where he made his new home. Dorothy and the wizard don't believe him at all, but they politely bid him goodbye before they continue up the mountain. The travelers decide to rest when they reach another landing. They discover that the piglets are visible again, meaning they're out of reach of the Valley of Vo's influence. Eureka again asks to eat one of the piglets, which is universally protested. They are eager to get to the country of the gargoyles, so they continue up the mountain. After another long climb, they pass the final stair and come across a strange new world. Everything in this country is made of wood. The ground is made of sawdust and wood knots, all houses and plant life are made of wood, and all the leaves on the trees are wood shavings. The most interesting part, of course, are the wooden people called gargoyles. They are very small in height, but round and disproportionate. They all have very different, ugly looks and short wooden wings that are fastened to their bodies. Strangely enough, they make no sound at all when they move. In fact, there was not a sound to be heard in this entire country. A group of gargoyles glare at the intruders in silence. The wizard, expecting trouble, grabs his satchel and takes out 2 revolvers. While they're speaking, the gargoyles noticeably recoil at the sounds, but once the talking ceases, the gargoyles attack. They first go after the horse, who is the most unfamiliar to them. Jim is able to kick several of the gargoyles away, and the noise causes them to retreat. The wizard notices how little damage Jim was able to inflict, and concludes that noise will be their only way to escape. The gargoyles return, and the wizard draws one of his revolvers and fires a shot into the sky. Several gargoyles fall to the ground in fear, and Zeb seizes one of them. Zeb ties up the gargoyle, which has a crown carved into its head, and then tosses their prisoner into the buggy. The wizard fires again every time the gargoyles renew their attack, and soon enough all 12 rounds have been fired. Our friends resort to yelling all together to ward off the gargoyles, and Zeb decides to use their bound gargoyle prisoner as a weapon. Their yelling works for a brief period of time, but they quickly run out of breath. Despite their best efforts at self-defense, they are outnumbered. The gargoyles succeed in capturing the wizard, Dorothy, Zeb, Eureka, and Jim, and they are carried into the air. They fly for miles before coming across a towering house with an opening under the roof. The gargoyles leave their prisoners in this opening, and they fly away. The new prisoners wonder why they didn't meet an instant death, and they theorize they may be kept for some sort of ceremony. They explore their prison, which brings them to several empty rooms with no doors or windows. Eureka slips away and watches the gargoyles from afar, realizing that when they sleep, they unhook their wings and hang them up. They begin to devise a plan regarding the wings. The wizard notices a stone mountain in the distance that goes up to the clouds. He suggests that they can steal the gargoyles' wings and fly to the mountain. Then they can climb inside and find their way back to the Earth's surface. Zeb unfastens Jim's harness and uses it as a rope to climb downwards from their heightened prison. He quietly disappears and eventually returns with 8 pairs of wooden wings. The wizard fastens 4 of the wings to Jim's harness, while the other 4 are fastened to the buggy. They all climb inside and order Jim to leap off of the platform. Their plan is successful, and within moments they are flying through the air. The gargoyles, who are beginning to wake up, see their prisoners escaping and immediately pursue them. Jim safely lands the buggy at the mouth of a cavern in the mountain, and then they use the wings to barricade themselves inside. The wizard lights them on fire, using the rest of his kerosene oil to ward off the gargoyles. There is an inclined tunnel inside the mountain that they tediously make their way through. After a long while, they come across a vast circular cave. In this cave, they see several dull yellow lights close to the ground that seem to flicker and move on their own. Eureka, who can see better in the dark than the humans, recoils at the sight of terrible creatures. A voice pipes in and asks them not to criticize their appearances. The wizard uses his lantern to illuminate the speaker, and they discover that the yellow lights are actually the eyes of what appear to be dragons. The creature explains that they are still dragonets that have yet to mature. Their mother has left to look for food, so she tied all of her children's tails to rocks so they wouldn't crawl away and cause mischief. The dragonet assures them that they would happily eat them if they could. Everyone continues to travel through the cavern, keeping a safe distance from the dragonets. They come across 2 separate paths, and they hurriedly choose one of them to walk along. It seems that they have chosen poorly because, after a great distance, they reach a dead end. They see a small crack in the roof above them, and they're frustrated to know that they are so close to the Earth's surface with no way to escape. Dorothy, however, conveniently remembers that Ozma will be checking her magic picture shortly, and that if she sees Dorothy is in trouble, she will rescue her. She also says that once she's in Oz, she can don the magic belt herself and have all of her friends transported to safety there. The wizard looks at his watch and notices that it's 3:30. Dorothy says Ozma will look at her picture at 4, so they just need to wait for half an hour. At 4 o'clock, Dorothy performs her and Ozma's predetermined signal and she disappears from the cave. In just a few moments afterward, the wizard, Zeb, Eureka, Jim, and the piglets suddenly appear in the Emerald City. Many servants greet their visitors, and the wizard is immediately recognized by Jellia Jam. He also reunites with the soldier with the green whiskers, except he's shaved since he became chief general of the royal armies. Jellia Jam brings their visitors to their accommodations in the Emerald City. The wizard is brought back to his own bedroom that he had while he lived in Oz, and Zeb is escorted to a new room. They are unsure of what to do with Jim, because they've never had a horse in Oz other than the sawhorse before. Zeb soaks in the luxuries in the palace before he and the wizard are escorted to the presence of Princess Ozma and Princess Dorothy. Ozma is very interested to meet the man who has built the Emerald City and united the countries of the Munchkins, Gillikins, Winkies, and Quadlings. The wizard introduces himself to Ozma and tells her of his history. He reveals that his real name is Oscar Zoroaster Phaedrig Isaac Norman Henkel Emmanuel Ambroise Diggs, and that he was born in Omaha. When he was growing up, he elected to call himself after his first 2 initials, OZ, because his last 7 initials spelt the word pinhead. He called himself a wizard because of his knack for ventriloquism, and when he joined the circus, he painted OZ on his balloon. When the balloon carried him to this country, he told them he was a wizard, and he believed they called him Oz because of the writing on the balloon. At the time he arrived, the 4 countries of the land of Oz were ruled independently by a witch. He had the Emerald City built at the corner of these 4 nations and announced himself as the ruler of Oz. He then lived there in peace until Dorothy came to Oz, when he returned to Omaha. Upon his arrival, he found that all his friends were dead or moved away, so he rejoined the circus. This is when one of his balloon trips went awry, and he was swallowed by the earth during a quake. Ozma pipes in to correct some details the wizard had gotten wrong. The land had always been united, and the ruler had always been called Oz, or Ozma, depending on their gender. Oz, according to the princess, means great and good in their language. 4 wicked witches then deposed the king and split the land so each of them could rule over the north, east, south, or west. One of these sorceresses was Mombi, who captured the current Princess Ozma's grandfather and imprisoned him. When the wizard arrived, the citizens of Oz believed he was their true ruler because of what had been printed on the balloon. A good witch then conquered Mombi in the north, and Glinda the Good conquered the wicked witch of the south. Mombi continued to imprison the royal family for generations, eventually turning Princess Ozma into a boy to hide her status as the true ruler. Ozma is indebted to the wizard for having the Emerald City built and reuniting the land of Oz, and she offers him permanent residency in Oz, as well as the title of official wizard. He tearfully accepts her offer. After dinner, the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, Billina, and Professor Wogglebug arrive in the Emerald City to celebrate Dorothy and the wizard's return. Meanwhile, Jim enjoys the royal treatment, which makes him a bit arrogant. He has his own large room where he's groomed and fed by the palace's servants. The next morning, he takes a walk to find some grass when he comes face to face with the Sawhorse. They look at each other curiously, never having seen horses of another variety. They compare their features and some competitiveness ensues before they're interrupted by the arrival of the Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger. Dorothy awakens and reunites with the lion and the tiger. As Dorothy re-enters the palace, a voice calls out to her, and she finds herself interacting with the Gump's head, which is placed over the fireplace. Ozma opens the door, gives Dorothy a good morning kiss, and tells her that breakfast is served. After breakfast, a large celebration is held in the city to honor their visitors. They're even joined by TikTok, who is happy to see Dorothy again. After a parade in the streets, they return to the throne room to watch the wizard perform his tricks. He repeats his piglet trick, and Ozma is sad when they all disappear. The wizard pretends to take a piglet out of Ozma's hair and then offers it to her as a pet. More festivities occur, including a wrestling match between Zeb and a Munchkin, which is won by the latter. The Scarecrow proposes a race between Jim and the Sawhorse. Their competitiveness overcomes them and they agree. The Sawhorse wins because the way he is constructed limits him less than Jim. Jim is ashamed by his defeat and loses his temper, so he kicks the Sawhorse down, breaking one of his legs in its left ear. The tiger jumps to his friend's defense and pounces on Jim, knocking him over. Jim apologizes and the beast retreats. The Tin Woodman fashions a new leg and ear for the Sawhorse, who is then crowned as the Prince of Horses by Ozma. A couple of days later, Dorothy and Ozma are sitting in the reception room when Ozma asks Jellia to grab her piglet. However, Jellia returns and announces that the piglet is not in her room. In fact, when she opened the door, Eureka had leapt out of the room and ran up the stairs. Dorothy and Ozma begin to fear for the piglet, knowing how badly Eureka wanted to eat one. Dorothy brings Eureka to Princess Ozma. When she is asked if she ate the piglet, Eureka pleads the fifth. Ozma orders the kitten to be imprisoned and announces a trial to commence at 3 o'clock, with the death penalty being reached if the cat is guilty. This causes quite a bit of excitement in the entire land, since it's been years since a crime had been committed. The jury consists of the lion, the tiger, Jim, Bellina, the scarecrow, the wizard, Tick-Tock, the sawhorse, and Zeb. The Tin Woodman is elected to represent the defendant, and the Wogglebug will represent the people. Before the trial begins, the wizard tries to interfere. He tells the Tin Woodman to present another one of the wizard's piglets at the trial, and claim it's the one Eureka is accused of eating, believing Ozma won't recognize the difference. The Tin Woodman reluctantly agrees. Ozma presides over the jury starting at 3 o'clock. The Wogglebug presents his case, and then Ozma questions Eureka. She asks if Eureka ate the piglet, and she again refuses to answer. The Tin Woodman then delivers his own address, but Eureka misbehaves and renders his argument fairly weak. He then produces the piglet, and Ozma is delighted to have her piglet back. However, Eureka points out that the piglet is not wearing the emerald collar that Ozma fitted it with, and therefore isn't the same piglet. But she finally decides to confess. She announces to the jury that she attempted to eat Ozma's piglet, but it had fallen off of a table and into a big vase where it had gotten stuck. When Dorothy demands to know why Eureka hadn't said that in the first place, the cat says it would have spoiled the fun. An officer goes to Ozma's room, frees the piglet from the vase, and returns it to the princess. And somehow, Eureka completely avoids an attempted murder charge and is released. The next evening, Dorothy uses Ozma's magic picture to see her Uncle Henry and Aunt Em. They are dressed in mourning on their farm in Kansas because they believe Dorothy was killed in the earthquake. Dorothy and Zeb decide to return home the next day with Jim and Eureka. In the morning, the wizard asks Dorothy to visit again sometime. She agrees, but under the condition that she can't be far from her uncle and aunt for long, as they will need her help. Ozma uses her magic belt to return Dorothy and Eureka to Kansas, and then she has Zeb and Jim return to Hugson's ranch. Zeb's Uncle Hugson is shocked and overjoyed to see him again, and he asks where in the world he's been. To this, Zeb slyly replies that he has been in the world. I will admit, this is a strange book. It has a much darker tone than the others I've read so far. The first half feels like an entirely different book in regards to the Oz series. The majority of it doesn't even take place in Oz, and the parts that do feel wholly unnecessary. The last few chapters detailing Jim and the Sawhorse's race, as well as the trial of Eureka, just seem like short stories that take place in Oz. They don't advance the plot that was introduced at the book's start, and they also don't really add much to Baum's lore. They feel more like padding than a conclusion to a fully rounded story. My hope is that the inclusion of these stories, as well as some seemingly useless characters along the way, such as the Braided Man, will be further expanded upon in future installments. It's also possible that many of these were suggestions from fans, and that he tried to please as many of them as possible by cramming them all into one book. Part of me wonders if Baum struggled to complete the book, as this is the shortest one so far and the most inconsistent. It also makes me wonder if this initially started out as a non-Oz book that Baum was trying to write, because I know he was eager to pursue other projects. Similar to how the sequels in the Cloverfield film franchise start as a sci-fi screenplay and it's modified to fit within the Cloverfield universe, I wonder if this is the case with this book because I know Baum had made a deal with the publisher to create a certain amount of Oz books. That being said, I didn't wholly dislike this installment. Despite it having a very different feel from the others, it was nice knowing more about Oz's history, and I liked seeing the wizard again so he could have his redemption arc. I'll admit I did get weepy hearing that his loved ones had all passed away or moved out of Nebraska, and Ozma's offer for him to remain in Oz with the people he lived with for so many years was very heartwarming. It continues to play into this found family motif that it began with the first book and has continued throughout each installment. However, I was bugged by a couple of continuity issues. When doing some research with the hopes of easing my confusion, I was surprised to find that many other fans noticed these errors in Baum's writing. The first one I noticed was that Dorothy says Ozma checks on her with her magic portrait every day at 4 o'clock. In the last book, however, it's written that Ozma agrees to check on Dorothy every Saturday morning. Do time zones exist in these different lands? Also, if Ozma has been keeping tabs on Dorothy daily, then why hadn't she rescued her at any point in the last few days when she was falling into a crack in the earth or trying to escape from the mangaboos? Another huge rewrite Baum completed in this book was the history between Ozma and the wizard. Glinda explains in the second book that the wizard had wrongfully usurped King Pastoria and then conspired with Mombi to hide Ozma so he could maintain his rule. In this book, Ozma and the wizard clearly haven't met at all, and the history of the Land of Oz seems much more complicated than it initially had been made out to be. The name Pastoria isn't mentioned, and it seems the wizard had no involvement in Ozma's disappearance, and Mombi had been revealed to be the former Wicked Witch of the North. Maybe that's why it's made clear in the second book that she's technically no longer a witch, because now it's against the law to be a witch. With this novel being released only 2 years after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, it's no surprise that Baum used this as a device to bring Dorothy to another adventure. The beginning and end of this book are very reminiscent of Ozma of Oz, which in my opinion is starting to become repetitive. Of course, she finds her way to a fairyland by way of natural disaster, which I was hoping could be avoided now that Ozma has the magic belt. At the end, Dorothy has her fun in the Land of Oz for a few days until she looks in Ozma's magic picture, she sees Uncle Henry and Aunt Em dressed in mourning, which brings on her decision to return to Kansas. Other than the inclusion of Zeb returning to his family's ranch in California, this ending is basically recycled from the previous book. I'm hoping that the next installment, entitled The Road to Oz, will deviate a bit more from this structure. I'm very interested to see what the future of this series holds. One pleasing detail I learned from this book is that the proper demonym for the citizens of Oz is Ozite. I had only ever heard the term Ozians, but I will be careful to use the term Ozites in the future. As always, here is my favorite quote from this book. If I do say so myself, it's a pretty raw line to have in a children's book. "No one can love a person he's afraid of," said by Dorothy. Another quote in particular comes from the wizard, and I thought it seemed to mirror Baum's feelings towards his fans. The wizard says, "I will cancel all of my engagements before the crowned heads of Europe and America and devote myself to the people of Oz, for I love you all so well that I can deny you nothing." This also provides an interesting Easter egg for fans of the 1939 film, because while in Kansas, Professor Marvel's caravan reads that he's acclaimed by none other than the crowned heads of Europe. Thank you again for listening in. If you have any interest in supporting the podcast, you can visit anchor.fm/OzRecap. I hope to create some video companions to some of these episodes in the future, and becoming a supporter would help me better create content for my fellow Oz fans. If you are interested in reading the Oz series along with me, all of Baum's novels are in the public domain and available online for free. They're easy to read, and the illustrations alone are so interesting to behold. You are now all members of my Oz book club. Sorry, I don't make the rules. Well, that's all I've got. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at OzRecap for updates and more Oz content. Until next time, I'm Justin, and this has been the wonderful recap of Oz.